as an observer of the end game, as it were, where do you think the wheels began to fall off for it? Was there some particular moment that you think the wheels began to fall off?
Well, in retrospect, it's easy. I mean, the wheels fell off 5 years ago. And it was about then that John Howard actually passed his political use-by date, but nobody noticed because the Labor Party weren't capable of capitalising on it. But we should have seen it coming, actually, because in 2004, when Mad Mark Latham was at the helm of the Labor Party, there was a period of months when the opinion polls showed that Australians really wanted to get rid of Howard. They didn't like him, they were sick of him, they were bored with him, they wanted to vote for somebody else. But eventually, of course, they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Mark Latham. So I really think it goes back that far. And of course, in 2007, when Kevin Rudd gave them somebody vaguely presentable as the alternative, they jumped at the chance.
Well, these things are always fought out in that no man's land, the middle ground there. It's still the case that probably 80% of the electorate is still largely bolted on to one party or another.
Bit less these days, I think, probably between 60 and 70. But yeah, so there is only that. You're fighting over that last 30% probably all the time. So unless you're a swinging voter at a marginal seat, you might as well go on holidays. There's nothing in the election for you at all.
And you think this 30% were up for it in terms of change, if only it was a matter of the Labor Party coming up with a suitable candidate?
Well, I think enough of them were. Some of them obviously decided they'd still prefer to stick with the old boy, but I really think a lot of them had got to the stage where they were simply sick of Howard. I mean, don't forget, Howard's never been loved by anybody, not inside his own party or outside it. Howard's been respected, Howard's been admired even, but he's never been loved. He's never had the sort of affection of the electorate in the way that some other Prime Ministers have. And I think that in that sense, he's always been living a bit on the edge. He swept into power in 1996 because he was opposed to Paul Keating. As Malcolm McGregor said at the time, he only won because he was against Keating. If he'd been standing unopposed, he would have lost. Seriously. And then in 1998, he couldn't get 50% of the vote. He won on a minority of the vote. In 2001, he had the Tampa. In 2004, he had Mark Latham. I mean, it's never been exactly clear-cut victory, a sweeping, resounding endorsement of John Howard. And I think that's always been his problem, that once a real alternative came up, he was always going to be vulnerable.
And yet the time that he was there, and it was a very long period of time, he was able to, put his mark on things in a pretty substantial way. Hang on,
I dispute this. You tell me what are the great lasting political monuments that Howard's left behind him in 12 years?
Well, I'm not so much thinking of the monuments as whatever a reverse monument is. The holes, the pits, that he dug. But there are certain things which have now undoubtedly changed, permanently.
Permanently?
Well, are we going to get ministerial responsibility back? Are we going just to talk
for a while? Yes, we are, because Rudd's decided that he will bring back ministerial responsibility, and for a little while at least he can be trusted to do it. I mean, he's come to power after a very long time in opposition. He's all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and idealistic, and he'll do it. And he will try and restore some semblance of independence to the public service, which is a much harder job, and I don't know whether he'll be able to do that or not, but he'll try.
Well, why do you say that? I mean, what is it about him that encourages you to think that? After all, the conventional wisdom would be that once you're the incumbent, once you're the government, you will take any advantage which has been offered to you in terms of the way the structures might have been changed. And clearly, it's a long time since Mick Young could be, forced from the ministry over whatever it was, a teddy bear.
Well, it is, and it's not,
Yeah.
and it's a long time since Howard sacked a minister for rorting his travel allowances
Well,
too.
exactly. So
but
when you come back in, why on earth would you open yourself up to this
Because-
potential avenue of attack?
Because, funnily enough, people want it. People do want an honest government in this country. They might be a bit cynical about the way it operates, but they would prefer it were honest.
Well,
And
but people always prefer that.
Okay,
but what encourages you to think that this would be?
So it is in your political interest to at least make the gesture, and particularly early in your term as Prime Minister, to show that you are different and therefore that you're worth giving a second go around to, and that therefore, you have brought a fresh and honest approach to government in this country, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it mightn't last forever, it probably won't, but I'll bet Rudd has a go at doing it, and I'll bet he honestly thinks that it's in his long-term political interest to do so, that good government eventually gets rewarded by the electorate.
Well, that was one example of Howard's that I threw up of Howard's
corruption
mark,
of the government process. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Okay.
Howard's subservience to the United States, that can be undone.
That can be undone. Okay. Well, to the extent that it's possible for any Australian government to undo its subservience to the
But at
US.
least we can get back to the sort of Hawke-like subservience as opposed to the Howard-like subservience.
Yeah. We can change the livery a bit.
Yeah.
That's true. And clearly the Americans have signalled, well, they'll cop that. They don't mind that.
We've done a good start in Bali. That has to be credit where it's due.
The stacking of various,
Again, Rudd said he won't
authorities.
stack public authorities. Again, we'll believe it when we see it. The temptation to reward people is always a great one. I mean, I would expect, for instance, either Kim Beazley or Bob Carter go to Washington as our next ambassador to Washington, and whichever one of them doesn't will probably be the next Governor General. But that will not be called jobs for the boys. That will be called a reward for tireless public service and to the best interests of the Australian.
as it always is. So does this mean that you really think what we've done is we've changed our clothes here, but there are no underlying scars? There's no substantial damage to the body politic?
Well, I think the thing about the Australian public is it's extraordinarily malleable. We like to think we're an independent, maverick, larrikin sort of mob here, that we don't respect authority, we don't kowtow to the politicians, we treat them cynically, blah, blah, blah. But in fact we don't. I mean, in fact, when we get a new Prime Minister, the country changes very quickly. We get a whole new feel about what the country stands for and where it's going. That's always happened.
Well, Australians have a rich imaginary life when it comes to their own self-image that
indeed.
quite often flies totally in the face of fact and experience. But is the country, as you say, the country will change. Where's the chicken and egg argument going on here? We've been repeatedly told you change the government, you change the country, but something must have changed about the country to make it want to change the government.
Only because it got bored. We're not only malleable, we have a relatively short attention span too.
So it's all that reality TV and so on. Executive makeover time, was it?
Everybody gets sick of things after a while. You want the new car or the new television set or a holiday somewhere exotic. And it does get to that stage. I mean, you can almost time it. After 10 years, any government's going to run out of puff. Any government. From either side, and the public is going to get restive. They're just going to get sick of doing the same thing and hearing the same thing, and there'll be a new generation come up which thinks it's somehow different from the old generation, and it will say, righto, it's time, and that's really all that happens, I think. And in that sense, I mean, there was nothing Howard could have done, nothing that would have retained him in office.
We saw these changes, though happening, maybe over a protracted period of time, not just in the immediate I was going to say lead up to the election. That was a
Indeed.
damned long runway, wasn't it? That entire
geological
year.
age before the election.
You know, as soon as Rudd hove into sight, we immediately began to get those poll figures. You know,
which were locked in,
we were getting,
month
you know,
after month,
looking at those lines, and they weren't budging. So you know, clearly people were ready to grasp. Well, just about anything.
Yeah, and clearly Howard simply refused to acknowledge it. He thought that all the tactics he'd used in the past could be made to work again. So spent the entire year pushing desperately against this door that was clearly marked pull, and trying the old scare tactics and the smear tactics and the bribe tactics and everything else that's worked for him in the past. But that was the wrong question. You know, it wasn't about who do you trust to run the economy. It wasn't about, you know, how's national security looking. It wasn't about, do you want unionists to come and break down your doors and steal everything off the shelves of your shop. It was about, you know, we're bloody sick of you, John, and we want to change, and we just don't believe you anymore, and we've stopped listening to you.
Well, he was very reluctant, of course, to accept that message.
Very. Well, surprise, surprise. Would you?
Do you think he ever really got it? Was there some point where you felt that, you know, maybe the penny had dropped and he did recognise the...
No, there wasn't, because when he pretended to, he was clearly lying. I mean, when he said to the party room, "Am I the problem?" and they all sort of shuffled their feet and looked at the ceiling and started whistling and made their excuses and left the room, he thought that was an endorsement. And then when he asked Alexander Downer, of all people, to sound out the ministry about whether he was the problem, and they all eventually said yes, he was, he said, "Oh, well, hang on, I'll get a second opinion on that. I'll go and ask Jeanette." And when Jeanette said, "I'm buggered if I'm leaving Kirribilli House 1 second before I have to," that was the end of that discussion.
I have to consult with my family.
Yes.
But here's a politician who, you know, has become a byword for cleverness.
Yes, but eventually the tricks just wear out. I mean, eventually when you've watched the guy doing the same trick year after year after year, either you say, "Okay, now I can see how it's done and I don't believe it's magic anymore," or you say, "I want a new trick. You know, show me a new trick."
It's a very hard-headed approach that he's taken for his entire career. He was very, very focused on winning elections, and that was what it was about. And nothing else, indeed. When I remember on the 10th anniversary of the 10 years. He was asked what his most substantial achievement was, and he said winning the 1998 election. Not that I had, you know, done something fantastic for the country. Just that. And
when he was asked, you know, after a series of bad opinion polls, what was going wrong and what would he do, he said, "Oh, I'll work much, much harder on behalf of the Australian people. ... to win the next election." I mean, that wasn't quite what they wanted to hear.
Look, it's a lot of fun getting stuck into John Howard now.
Well, it is, isn't it? Yeah. Let's dance on the grave a bit more.
And the election, of course, was very much, presidential in style. It was about him, undoubtedly.
And about Rudd, to the extent that if Rudd had blown up in the way Mark Latham did, then probably the electorate would have decided, look, no matter how sick of him we're not going to take a risk. We want a risk-free change. But being the timid mob that Australians mainly are.
Well, let's talk about Rudd in a moment, but just as an observer of the campaign in its entirety,
in all its horror,
there were of course a lot more things happening out there than simply John Howard in electorate by electorates, and also I think the media was. The divide between the media and the public on this in some instances was just quite amazing.
Quite extraordinary.
What was happening there? I mean, is this just a mass marbles defection or something?
Well, I mean, the media simply couldn't believe that a government which they thought was a successful government and a government with the economy under control was getting itself into trouble, because they were all asking the wrong questions too. I mean, the question wasn't about, is the economy doing well? The question was, how do you feel? And nobody asked that. The media didn't ask it. And so you had this absurd situation where the polling was running solidly, 8-10% difference between the parties, week after week after week. And the commentators were saying things, we have two realities here. We have the inside the Beltway reality and the outside the Beltway reality, and then the political reality, everything's going brilliantly and smoothly and the government should be returned easily. But in the outside reality, where the people don't seem to understand this, they're saying something entirely different. It was that old Brechtian thing about, we'll have to abolish the electorate because the electorate keeps getting it wrong.
Yeah.
And they couldn't understand that there weren't two realities. There was one. There was the factual reality of what the polls were showing, and the other reality existed purely in their heads. It didn't exist anywhere else at all.
We've got this sort of little swarm of commentators, the commentariat or whatever, who, it should be pointed out immediately, are not members of the elite or elites, never drink Chardonnay, and have never been seen drinking cafe lattes, but are somehow pronouncing forth on the state of the way the world is. We're rather sort of elevated figures, perhaps elevated to some extent because of the large amount of hot air and gas that they contain, but we've also got a closed circuit that operates around the parliamentary press gallery.
Absolutely.
Locked into that sort of large kind of semi-underground bunker in Parliament House. Do you think it's inevitable that the press ends up regarding the whole electoral process in this rather closed way, or is there something else at work here?
Well, I think there are two things going on at the same time here. I mean, one is you have all the super-duper commentariat, the absolute chiefs who are sitting there in Parliament House, or in some cases not even in Parliament House. In some cases they sit in Sydney or Melbourne. But they sit in their offices surrounded by acolytes and sycophants and being rung up and duchessed by senior politicians who keep telling them how clever they are and exactly what they should be writing to show how clever they are. And on the other hand, you have what might be called the working press, who are running around actually on the ground talking to people. And it was the working press talking to people who were all absolutely sure that the world was moving against John Howard. And it was the super-duper commentators who never got out in the open air who were the ones saying, no, this can't be happening. This is a parallel universe where everything's gone wrong. I mean, the people who believed Howard when he said, I think the electorate might be having a joke with us in the opinion polls. And I think this is one of the problems you have now, that that locked-in circle of the pack leaders, as it were, are the ones who get all the attention, whereas the ones who actually know what's going on are the ones who are locked on the campaign bus and are there simply to report the stunts of the campaign rather than the substance. I mean, it's not universally true. There were 3 or 4 people during this campaign who I thought were worth reading, 3 or 4 of the heavies, who had a different view. But by and large, there was still this line being pursued by those locked into the political inner circle who were saying, no, this can't be happening, it can't be happening. It won't happen. It's not going to happen because it never has before and it never should. And anyway, I say it shouldn't. And that, as if they were somehow making reality. It was quite. I found it extraordinary. That's one of the reasons I called this book Pole Dancing, because the polls were so central to it in the various interpretations of the polls, and the people who were in denial about the polls and the people who were trying to be reinforced by the polls and so on.
Well, the omens were all there. They were examining the entrails of the same duck or goose or whatever over and over again, and getting the same result.
Well, they were getting the same numbers out of it, but they were interpreting those numbers quite differently. I mean, one of the sillier lines that went on during the campaign was people kept saying, oh yes, the Labor vote might be up 10% over in two-party terms over the Conservative vote, but it's a soft vote. Why do they say that? Week after week after week, it doesn't move. In what way is it possibly meant to be soft? I mean, how do we define this circumstance? The public's terribly volatile, they say, you know, and these polls are just not moving. If that's volatility, you know.
Why are they so ready to fall in?
Because they hunt as a pack. They've always hunted as a pack. And nowadays, with news so tightly controlled, I mean, under Howard's reign of terror, all the normal sources of alternative news, the public service, for instance, dried up completely. Backbenchers, nobody was game to talk the way about what they actually believed. So the reporters were all getting their news straight from the press releases from both sides. They were all being spoon-fed the same basic information and the same basic opinions, and both sides were very well disciplined. They stayed on message, as we say, through the whole campaign. And so there just wasn't anything to form an alternative view around. I certainly don't think it was the proprietors. I mean, if you look at the last week of the campaign, even the Murdoch press was everywhere. You had some papers advocating a Labor vote and some papers advocating a Liberal vote, and people saying all such sorts of things for different reasons. So in that sense there was less control at the top than probably there has been for a long time. But then there wasn't any need for it, because the working journalists, the opinion leaders, were also locked into this theory that it just happened. I mean, I do think that news control thing, which is partly a function of the way things work in the Parliament House itself, the isolation of Parliament House and the fact that no one runs into each other by accident on purpose anymore. Everything's tightly controlled, the ministerial wing's tightly separated from the backbenchers, and that's separated from the press gallery, and that's separated from the reps and the senators, separated and so on.
Never mind letting the public in.
Oh, bugger the public. but I mean, all of that, it's a different system, and it does lead to this extraordinarily thing where it just feeds back on each other. The journalists say something and the politicians believe it, and they adapt it slightly and feed it back to the journalists, and you get everybody disappearing up each other's arses without anything coming out of substance.
And the almost slavish attention to Laurie Oakes's pronouncements.
Yes, well, Laurie Oakes and Paul Kelly and Michelle Grattan are sort of the holy trinity of the gallery, and people seem to think that anything they said must, by definition, be right and authoritative, because everybody knew that the senior politicians talked to them and they had access to these amazing sources, and therefore they couldn't possibly be wrong. And of course they were wrong, time after time after time.
And yet consistently they were also setting the story for the day.
Well, they were, except they weren't part of the story for the day. I mean, they weren't the ones on the buses. They weren't the ones who were following Howard and run around the country. They were sitting in their offices writing learned pieces about how badly everybody else was reporting it. And that again is one of the big problems about this campaign.